Imagine walking into a luxurious restaurant where everything seems impeccable until something unexpected happens. A group of rich women decide to humiliate a humble black waitress, unaware that they are about to witness something that will change everything. You know that chill down your spine when something big is about to happen? Well, watch out, because what's about to happen is going to surprise you. The sound of cutlery hitting fine china echoed through the restaurant hall. Golden lights hung from the chandeliers, reflecting off the crystal goblets and sparkling jewels that adorned the women sitting at the tables. It was an atmosphere that exuded wealth, where everything seemed to shine except her, Emily, the waitress. She glided between the tables, balancing trays of expensive dishes, always attentive, always invisible. She felt the stares. The judgment was palpable. They weren't just curious glances. They were sharp blades piercing her skin, constantly reminding her of her place there. Little by little, the pressure increased like an invisible hand on her neck, squeezing. But she smiled. It was the only shield she had, a trained smile, perfectly placed on her face, even though her soul was being crushed. She knew that those women didn't see a person. They saw a shadow, something that passed by and disappeared without significance. "Look at that one of them laughed, breaking the silence around her. Her voice echoed with scorn in the hall. "She can't even keep her plate up." The others, dressed in designer clothes, joined in the laughter. The cruel sound reverberated, each laugh pushing Emily deeper into her own invisibility. She kept her smile. "Don't show weakness," she thought, but the heat rose to her face, her body locked, her fingers squeezing the cloth of the tray hard enough to almost tear it. His eyes lowered, shame burning in his cheeks. "You should see her house," another woman continued, her gaze full of disgust. "I bet it's as messy as her hands." Emily didn't need to look to know that they all agreed with derisive giggles. She never had to listen to know what they thought of her. Inferior. They saw only her skin and the uniform she wore. One of them held out an empty glass, the cold glass barely touching her hand, but the woman's gaze burned. It was as if the simple act of handing her that glass was a humiliation. "Of course, ma'am. I'll get you some more water right away." Her voice was firm, controlled, but inside she was on fire. The weight of prejudice and contempt was an invisible chain that bound her, tightening more and more every minute. They knew nothing about her. Emily wasn't just any waitress, she was a fighter. But to those women, she was just a shadow, a cog in the wheel of that luxurious restaurant. As she walked away, carrying the plates, the murmurs of disdain echoed in her mind like a hammer, crushing any sense of dignity she might have had. As she moved away from the tables, far enough away that they couldn't hear, she took a deep breath, trying to control the turmoil inside her. It wasn't just the prejudice. It wasn't just being treated like nothing. It was the constant reminder of where she was and that she might never be able to leave. Emily knew she was trapped in that reality. She had dreams, of course, but the dreams always seemed distant, as out of reach as the lively conversations and laughter that filled the restaurant. Hours passed, each one longer than the next, and finally the shift ended. The restaurant gradually emptied, but the echo of the humiliations was still pounding in her head. It was as if she could still hear the laughter, as if she was trapped in that moment, in that endless night. As she stepped out of the door, the cold night air enveloped her, a momentary relief. The city lights seemed less intense than those in the restaurant, and the night breeze brought her back to reality. But even there, outside, she still felt the weight of that place, the burden of being treated as less. Emily leaned against a post, waiting, and then she saw her. Rachel, her childhood friend, was there as always, with her old bike and that warm smile that never failed. "Hey, Emily!" She waved, her eyes shining with joy, as if she could chase away all the darkness of the night. For a moment, Emily felt her body relax. This was the only part of her day that made her forget who she was in the restaurant. With Rachel, she could breathe. "How was today?" Rachel asked, leaning against the bike, her voice light but with a hint of concern. She knew how much Emily suffered in that place. "Another day, another few humiliations," Emily replied with a half smile, trying to appear indifferent but unable to hide her bitterness. She wanted Rachel not to carry that weight with her, but the words came out unfiltered, smiling as a shield worked for customers, but not for herself. That night had been no different from the others. The jokes, the looks of disgust, the constant feeling of being small in a place where everything seemed bigger than her. Emily took a deep breath, trying to push her feelings far away. When she walked down the stairs of the restaurant and saw Rachel waiting outside, relief came like a wave she didn't know she needed. "How was today?" Rachel asked, concern masked in a warm smile. Emily tried to look strong. "Nothing much, just more of the same." But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just more of the same. Inside, she felt like a pressure cooker was about to explode. She looked at her friend and let out a forced laugh, trying to break the ice. But the truth was different. Every word of contempt she heard that night seemed to have lodged somewhere deep inside her, a dark place she didn't want to touch. Rachel was too perceptive to let it go. "You need to stop letting it get to you, Emily." Her voice was firm, but full of affection. "You're better than them. Who are they to bring you down?" The words came in but didn't find much room to stay. The day had been heavy. I know, but it's hard. I don't know how much longer I can take this. It seems to get worse and worse." She couldn't hide it any longer. Every day in the restaurant, the weight on her back grew a little heavier. And even outside, that weight was still there, dragging with it, reminding her of her place. They walked together through the dark streets, Emily kicking a pebble here and there, as if the movement would help clear her head. "Sometimes I wonder if this is what my life is going to be like. You know, just being a waitress, going through this every day until I can't take it anymore." Rachel stopped, pulling her by the arm. "And why do you think that? Remember your paintings? You have a gift, Emily. You always have. Ever since you were a child. Why don't you try focusing on that? Get out of this rut." Ah, the paintings. As if it were so simple. Emily lowered her gaze, kicking the floor harder. "I barely have time, Rachel. I come home exhausted. I can barely think, let alone paint." It wasn't an excuse, it was the truth. She wanted to, she really wanted to. But how could she do that when she spent all day serving those women who treated her as if she were invisible? How could she create something beautiful when she felt so crushed? She felt trapped. That was it, as if there were invisible chains holding her feet, preventing her from taking a single step out of that cycle. Rachel kept talking, trying to ignite something inside her. But Emily was already far away, lost in her own thoughts, sunk in that feeling that was consuming her. When she finally got home, the silence was suffocating. The small apartment, the gray and empty walls reflected how she felt inside. She threw her bag on the floor and looked around. There in the corner of the room was her mother's old box. She hadn't opened it for a long time. Ever since her mother had left, Emily had avoided touching it. It was like an unhealed wound. But that night, something pulled her there. Perhaps it was frustration, anger, or even tiredness at feeling like she was living someone else's life. With trembling hands, she opened the box. The first thing she saw was an old photo of her mother holding a paintbrush, smiling as if the whole world was in front of her. Emily ran her fingers over the image, feeling a tightness in her chest. Her mother, the great artist, strong, confident, everything Emily didn't feel she was. Underneath the photo, there were newspaper clippings with reviews praising her mother's exhibitions, each one more complimentary than the last. She had always known that her mother had been talented, but seeing those words in black and white, written by people who admired her, only added to the feeling of inadequacy. Emily murmured to the photo, "You were so strong, Mom. Why am I not like that?" The answer was silence. Just silence. She looked down at the papers in her hands and, for a moment, felt the anger begin to turn into something else. Determination. Perhaps it was tiredness. Perhaps it was the accumulation of everything she had been feeling. But something inside her began to change. She closed the box slowly, like someone holding not only memories, but a promise. Maybe it was time to try. Maybe it was time to stop listening to the voices that told her she wasn't good enough. The next day, the restaurant was the same as always, full of muffled laughter and despicable murmurs that floated around the room like a silent poison. Emily circulated among the tables with the same mask on her face, a forced smile that hid the storm roaring inside. But this time, something was different. Her mother's box, the forgotten paintings, the buried memories. All this echoed in her mind, mixing with the oppressive reality that surrounded her. The weight of her routine was crushing her. The physical fatigue was evident, but that wasn't all. It was as if each day, each shift, each acid comment from the clients was tearing away a piece of her soul. Emily did everything she could to keep her head up, but the truth was that she was crumbling inside. Rachel's voice echoed in her heed, encouraging her to follow the path of art. You have talent, Emily. You always have. But how could she believe that? How could she see anything special in herself when she spent her life being reminded that she was nothing more than a waitress, a shadow in the background of a luxurious salon? At the end of the shift, the physical pain was the same as always. But what really weighed her down was the doubt that had haunted her since the moment she opened her mother's box. What if she tried? What if she failed again? What was worse, continuing in that life, invisible and crushed, or taking a chance and failing? It was as if she was trapped in a dead end, with fear closing every door around her. Walking home, tiredness seemed to creep up her legs, and she could barely climb the stairs of the building. Her mind was in a whirl, each thought heavier than the last. When she opened the apartment door, the first thing she saw was the corner of the makeshift studio, where the paints and brushes were covered in dust. It was like looking at a part of herself that had been dormant for a long time. Emily stopped in front of the painting table, her trembling hands running through the brushes, as if trying to find some answer there. But all she felt was emptiness, an endless hole in her chest. She wanted to believe that there was still something inside her, something that would make her feel alive again. But the weight of past failure pulled her down. She hesitantly picked up a brush and dipped it into the blue paint. The first stroke on the canvas was timid, almost erased. But there, in that movement, there was something. A spark. The accumulated anger, the contempt he felt every day, the weight of carrying on his mother's legacy, all this seemed to mix with the paint, overflowing with each stroke. But the doubt was still there. What if she wasn't good enough? What if people only saw her as the artist's daughter, without ever recognizing what she really was? Every brushstroke was a confrontation between what she wanted to be and what the world said she was. She painted until her hands began to shake with fatigue, until her body begged for rest. But the canvas was still incomplete, just like her. It was a reflection of her own life, full of marks, unfinished layers, desperately trying to find a form, a meaning. Deep down, Emily knew she was fighting an internal battle. It wasn't just about painting, it was about proving to herself that she could be more than a waitress, that she could be more than what other people saw. But as she looked at the canvas, discouragement came over her again. What did she really want? Would she ever be able to break out of the cycle that bound her? She put down her brush, her eyes fixed on the half-finished canvas. The silence of the apartment enveloped her, heavy. As much as she wanted to believe something different, the doubts continued to whisper in her mind, as loud as the mocking laughter of the restaurant's customers. Before turning off the lights, Emily looked at the painting one more time. She knew that deep down, this was her fight. The canvas wasn't just a work of art, it was a mirror of her uncertainties, the scars she carried and the fear of not being enough. The discouragement was immense, but there somewhere was a spark. She just had to decide whether to nurture it or let it go out for good. The days at the restaurant remained the same. The customers' laughter bounced off the walls, always sharp, always directed at her. But now there was something different about Emily. It was as if, beneath the suffocating routine and the daily humiliations, something had been awakened. It wasn't big enough to keep the sadness at bay, but it was enough to stop her from sinking completely. After each exhausting shift, Emily would return home with a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. That feeling of not belonging, of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, now drove her back to the small makeshift studio in the corner of the apartment. The paints, which had previously been covered in dust, were now her escape. Every night, even exhausted, she sat down in front of the canvas. The brushes were no longer strange in her hands. And with each new stroke, Emily felt like she was unloading more than just paint. It was as if she was releasing a part of herself that she had locked away for years. Her anger, her frustrations, her pain. It was all there, mixed into the colors that now danced across the canvas. The nights were long and lonely, but in this silence, she found something she had forgotten. Emily remembered who she was. There was a spark, a small flame, that for a long time had been smothered by the pressures of life. But now, fueled by her frustration, it was beginning to grow. With every stroke, every coat of paint, determination blossomed. It wasn't just a question of painting, it was a question of survival. It was what kept her going, what made her feel that perhaps there was something more than the trays and the looks of contempt. One evening, while Emily was working on the canvas, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Rachel, as always, appearing at the moments when she needed her most, even though she didn't know it. "You're really taking this seriously, aren't you?" Rachel said, coming in and looking at the still unfinished painting. She paused for a moment, admiring her friend's work, her eyes scanning every detail. "This is amazing, Emily. You're putting your soul into it." Emily shrugged, trying to disguise the pride she felt inside. It's, it's what I have left." Her voice came out low but firm. Rachel knew that this was no small thing. "You should show it to the world, you know. You can't keep this talent hidden away in this apartment. There's a local art competition. It would be perfect for you." Emily's heart raced. Competition? Her? Compete? The idea seemed absurd. Competition? I don't know. What if no one likes it? What if it's not good enough? Rachel moved closer, her eyes serious now. "You can't live with that fear, Emily. You're good enough. And you know it. You just have to allow yourself to believe it." The doubt was still there, gnawing at her chest. But the idea of taking part in a competition wouldn't leave her head. It would be a chance to prove herself, to show the world that she was more than just an invisible waitress. But it was also an opportunity to fail in a way she had never experienced before. In the days that followed, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time she looked at the screen, she felt the weight of the decision. The competition was the opportunity she had always wanted, but her fear of failure was as strong as her desire to try. Until one night, as she looked at the painting, now almost complete, something inside her changed. She knew she couldn't live with the what-ifs forever. If she failed, she would fail trying. But not trying, that was a weight she could no longer carry. With the same determination that made her face each day in that restaurant, Emily decided she was going to take part in the competition, and she was going to go all out. When she told Rachel the news, her friend smiled, that warm smile that always made her feel that anything was possible. "I knew you'd do it. You're going to rock it, Emily. It'll be your chance to show the world who you really are." And for the first time in a long time, Emily believed it too. The canvas was still incomplete, but now she knew how to finish it. It wasn't just a painting, it was a piece of her story, and she was determined to make everyone see it. The morning of the competition came quicker than Emily expected. She was standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the simple dress she had bought especially for the occasion. It was nothing fancy, but it was the best she could afford. As she looked in the mirror, every detail seemed out of place. Her hair, her nails, the dress, everything seemed wrong. Her stomach churned. What was she doing? How could she dare to think she deserved to be there? An art competition with real artists, people who dedicated their lives to it. And her? A waitress who barely had time to rest, let alone create. She almost let herself be carried away by this wave of thoughts, but the memory of her long nights painting, of every stroke she made, fighting against tiredness, brought her back. Emily had worked hard to be there. That painting was more than just colors on the canvas. It was part of who she was. She couldn't give up now. Still, the fear of failure was there, pulsing through her veins. What would they do when they saw her painting? Would they laugh at it? Would they think it was a joke? It wasn't just about the art, it was about her. To show that painting was to show a part of herself that she had never shown to anyone, and that terrified her. When Rachel appeared at the apartment door, ready to accompany her to the gallery, Emily felt a twinge of relief. She wasn't alone. "You look beautiful, Emily, and your painting, it's incredible. It's going to be a success. You'll see." Rachel tried to cheer her up, but she could see the tension in her friend's shoulders. The walk to the gallery was silent. Emily was lost in her thoughts, each step seeming heavier than the last. When they finally arrived, she paused for a moment, looking at the imposing building in front of her. The glass doors reflected their image back at her, and for a moment, all she saw was the waitress. The woman who spent hours on end serving rich women who despised her. She didn't see an artist, but then Rachel put her hand on her shoulder. "You're more than you think, Emily." Her friend's voice was soft but firm. "You're already here. Now all you have to do is show the world what you can do." Swallowing her nervousness, Emily entered. The gallery was full. Well-dressed people circulated around the works, discussing what they saw, pointing out details she could barely recognize. Her eyes quickly scanned the room until they found her own painting, positioned in the corner. From a distance, she saw some eyes turn to her work. Her heart raced. Emily wanted to run, to get out of there before someone said something negative. But it was too late. She was there, and so was the painting. There was no going back. The hours dragged by. Emily remained in a mixture of anxiety and anticipation, waiting, dreading every reaction to her work. Some people stared, some stopped, but no one said anything directly to her. The uncertainty was suffocating. Suddenly, Victoria, one of the women who always humiliated her in the restaurant, appeared. Emily froze. Victoria was there, with the same sarcastic smile as always, surrounded by her friends. She stopped in front of the painting, staring at it for a few seconds. Emily held her breath, anxiety rising like a wave about to crash. Victoria turned slowly, and the look she threw at Emily was full of disdain. "Is that yours? I thought it would be bigger, more impressive." The words came out like poison, each one piercing Emily's confidence. Victoria's friends laughed quietly, and Emily felt the heat rise through her body, her face burning with shame. She wanted to disappear. She wished she'd never left the house. There, in that silence, Victoria's words echoed in her mind. "You're not good enough." That's what she always felt in the restaurant, and now, once again, it hit her hard. But before she could sink into that hole, Rachel appeared beside her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The simple touch of her hand on Emily's shoulder was enough to remind her why she was there. That painting was a part of her, a part that Victoria and her friends would never understand. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes returning to the painting. The colors, the shapes, everything was an expression of her story, of her struggle. It didn't matter what Victoria said or thought. It was hers. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a wave of courage rise up inside her. The competition was no longer about winning or losing. It was about having the courage to show who she was, to allow herself to be vulnerable, even with the fear of rejection. Emily straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. She was there, and that was a victory. At the end of the evening, when the judges began to assess the works, Emily waited, nervous, but with a new strength inside her. Whatever the outcome, she knew she had done something greater than she had ever imagined. She had faced her fear, and that was a victory in itself. That night seemed to have no end. The gallery hall, once bright and vibrant, began to darken in Emily's mind. After Victoria's venomous comment, she felt like she was in the restaurant again. The target of the laughter, the scornful looks, the mean jokes that took away her dignity little by little. It was always the same. No matter how hard she tried, she was always reminded that she didn't belong in that world. She remained silent, still standing next to her painting, feeling her body tense. Her fingers tightened on the plastic cup she was holding, enough to almost crush it. The anger was there, boiling inside her, mixed with humiliation, shame, and the constant fear of never being enough. It was like an electric current running through her veins, every word from Victoria igniting a new thread of hatred. But there was something different this time. Instead of sinking into that feeling of inferiority, something inside Emily began to stir. An inner voice, almost drowned out by humiliation, began to shout at her. And for the first time, she listened. She looked at her painting again. The vibrant colors, the strong, striking shapes. Everything there was a reflection of her life, of her struggle to exist in a world that insisted on diminishing her. Each brushstroke carried her anger, her disappointments, and the strength she didn't even know she possessed. Those women, Victoria and her friends, had no idea who she was, what she had been through, the struggles she faced on a daily basis. They only saw the waitress uniform, the black skin that they silently despised. But there, on that canvas, Emily was not the waitress. There, she was the artist, the woman who refused to be silenced. With this new strength bubbling up in her chest, Emily lifted her chin and took a deep breath. She didn't need the approval of Victoria or anyone else there. Her art wasn't for them. Her art was for herself. It was an expression of her own truth, something that no one could take away from her, no matter what anyone said or how they tried to diminish it. As she walked slowly through the hall, her anger became fuel. Instead of shrinking under the scornful stares, she felt her body straighten up, her steps become firmer. That painting, that competition, were her answer to all those who doubted her, who underestimated her, who treated her as if she were invisible. No matter what happened from that moment on, Emily knew she was there to be seen, to be heard. When the jurors finally reached her painting, she stood to the side, watching them in silence. Her heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't just fear. It was anticipation. She was ready. Ready for anything they said. Ready for any judgment that came. She knew the value of her work. She knew what it represented. The jurors spent some time in front of her painting, evaluating it, discussing it amongst themselves. They didn't say anything directly to her, but their expressions were focused, serious. After a few minutes, they moved on to the next work, leaving Emily alone once again. But something was different now. The humiliation that Victoria had tried to dump on her had been absorbed, transformed into strength. Emily had been through worse. She had survived humiliation at work, daily scorn, the struggle to stand on her own 2 feet when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. And now, once again, she had made it. She took a deep breath, feeling the air enter her lungs as if she were taking a breath after spending a long time underwater. The mere fact that she had presented herself there, that she had had the courage to show her painting, was already a personal victory. It was the first time that Emily had allowed herself to believe that she could be more than what others saw. By the end of the evening, Emily knew that, regardless of the outcome of the competition, she had overcome something much greater. She was no longer just the invisible waitress who hid behind forced smiles. Now she was a woman who knew her worth and who wouldn't let anyone, especially people like Victoria, take that away from her. She left the gallery with her head held high, and although the night was dark, Emily could finally see a light on the path ahead of her. The silence that filled the hall when the judges took to the stage was almost deafening. Emily was there, standing at the back, her hands sweaty and her heart beating so hard that she could hardly think of anything else. Around her, the whispered conversations of the other people seemed distant, drowned out by the sound of her own nervousness. The anxiety was palpable. She felt the weight of all her decisions, every sleepless night, every stroke full of doubt and frustration, culminating in that moment. The presenter adjusted the microphone and began to speak, going through the names of the participants, praising everyone's talent and dedication. Emily heard the words, but they sounded distant, as if they were coming from a place she couldn't reach. She couldn't imagine her name being mentioned. Not after everything. Not after so many years of feeling invisible, so many humiliations, so many times being treated like nothing. And then the impossible happened. And tonight's award goes to Emily Thompson for her work Resilience. For a moment, Emily froze. The words didn't seem real. Her mind couldn't process what had just happened. Time seemed to stop, and everything around her disappeared. The lights, the people, the voices. Everything dissolved into a blur, except for the sound of her name echoing through the hall. It was her. She had won. The clapping started low, but soon became a deafening cheer. She could see Rachel at the front, with tears in her eyes, clapping so enthusiastically that it felt like her hands were going to hurt. But Emily remained paralyzed, the shock still holding her in place. A gentle tap on her shoulder brought her back to reality. It was one of the organizers, smiling at her, encouraging her to take the stage. Her feet felt heavy, but she moved them. Each step felt like an immense effort, as if she still couldn't believe it was happening. When she finally reached the stage with everyone's eyes on her, she held the trophy with trembling hands. The weight of the trophy was an almost surreal sensation. It was as if, suddenly, everything she had been carrying around for so long, the fear, the insecurity, the humiliation, was being replaced by something else. Relief, pride. She looked at the trophy in her hands and, for the first time, felt that she really deserved to be there. The bright stage lights obscured her vision a little, but she could see the faces in the audience. Some expressions of surprise, others of admiration, and then she saw Victoria, standing at the back, motionless. Victoria's usual look of contempt had disappeared, replaced by an expression that Emily couldn't decipher. Perhaps it was surprise, perhaps it was anger, but somehow it didn't matter anymore. Victoria no longer had any power over her. As the noise of the applause began to die down, Emily realized it was time to speak. The microphone was in front of her, but the words wouldn't come. For so long, she had imagined what that moment would be like. But now that she was there, what could she say? She took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch on for a few more seconds. And then she finally found her voice. I I don't know what to say, she began, her voice shaking a little, but firm enough to be heard. For a long time, I felt invisible, as if my life was all about getting through things without leaving a mark. But today is different. She looked at Rachel, feeling the warmth of her friend's presence, the silent support that had always been there. This painting isn't just about me. It's about all of us who have ever felt invisible, who have thought that the world saw us as less. But we are much more than that. The words came out naturally, but each one carried an immense weight. It was as if each sentence was a release, a way of freeing herself from the chains that had bound her for so long. I am Emily Thompson, and this is my story. Thank you. As she stepped down from the stage, still in shock, relief hit her like a wave. It was as if all the weight she had been carrying had finally been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt light, free. She ran into Rachel as soon as she left the stage, and her friend hugged her so tightly that she almost lost her breath. I knew you'd do it. I knew it all along, Rachel said between laughter and tears. But as they celebrated, something began to change inside Emily. She had won, yes, but there was still a restlessness. When she picked up her cell phone to check for congratulatory messages, an unknown number popped up on the screen with a short, cold message. Congratulations, Emily. But be careful. The past always comes back. The relief she felt at winning was quickly replaced by something else. What did it mean? Who was trying to threaten her? Even at the moment of her greatest victory, the past seemed determined to pull her back. And now Emily knew that, despite her victory, there were still many battles ahead. As Emily looked at the message on her cell phone, her heart, which moments before was pounding with the excitement of victory, was now clenching with fear. That simple phrase, "the past always returns," seemed heavier than the trophy in her hands. Who had sent it? And what did they know? Her past had always been something she guarded carefully, as if hiding a scar she didn't want to expose. But now it seemed to threaten to explode in unpredictable ways. As she left the gallery with Rachel by her side, the joy of the award no longer had the same glow. Rachel, still excited, talked about the win, about the bright future Emily would have ahead of her. But she could hardly pay attention. Her thoughts were fixed on that message. Something dark was approaching, and she didn't know how to deal with it. That evening when she got home, Emily threw herself on the sofa, exhausted. The trophy was there, gleaming on the table, but her gaze was fixed on the screen of her cell phone. The words seemed to echo in the empty room. The tension in the air was suffocating. It wasn't long before the phone vibrated again, and his heart almost stopped. Another message. You thought you could get away with it, but everyone knows who you really are. Emily felt her stomach sink. Her past. What did people know? What did they think she was hiding? It was as if she was being pulled back into a place she had fought so hard to get out of. She took a deep breath, trying not to let the panic take over. No matter what happened, she couldn't let it destroy her. Not now. Not after everything. The next morning, Rachel showed up at her house, immediately noticing her friend's nervousness. What's going on, Emily? You won, but you're acting like something bad is about to happen. What is it? Her voice trembling, Emily showed her the messages. Rachel was silent for a moment, reading every word carefully. Do you know who could be doing this? Emily shook her head. No, I don't know. But it seems that someone knows something about my mother, about her past. Something I don't know. Rachel sighed, clearly worried. Listen, Emily, you can't let this get you down. Whatever it is, you have to face it. You've been through so much, survived so much humiliation. You can't let it paralyze you now. Rachel's words were a breath of fresh air in the chaos that was Emily's mind. She knew her friend was right. No matter what the past brought, she had to be ready. She couldn't run away. With a final sigh, she decided that she would face it, whatever it was. She had come too far to allow fear to make her go back to the place she had run away from. 2 days later, Emily was back at the restaurant, trying to act as if everything was normal. The competition trophy didn't seem so significant in the midst of that suffocating routine, where the same women who had once ridiculed her now treated her with a mixture of curiosity and disguised contempt. But the restlessness wouldn't leave her. The fear of what would come next accompanied her, day and night. Then, just as she was about to leave, an unknown man entered the restaurant. He was tall, with gray hair, and a serious expression that immediately caught her attention. He approached her, standing at the counter like any other customer, but there was something in his eyes that made her freeze. "Emily Thompson?" he asked without preamble. She nodded, her throat dry, feeling the panic rising. "Yes, it's me. Can I help you?" The man took a deep breath and handed her an envelope. "I was a good friend of your mother's. I've been to all her exhibitions, but what few people know is that she had a struggle you could never have imagined." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Emily's feet. What she had feared had arrived. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside were a series of documents, old photos of her mother. Some Emily already knew, but others were new, taken during difficult times, which she had never seen before. Next to the documents was a letter. The letter was written by her mother, a confession. She talked about the pressures she faced in the art world as a black woman in an elitist and racist environment. She told how, at one point, she had to hide part of her life in order to continue to be accepted in galleries and exhibitions. The secret? She had assumed a different identity, a false history to escape prejudice. Her real family name, her humble past, everything had been erased so that she could survive in that cruel world. Emily felt a deep pain in her chest. Her mother, the woman she had always admired as strong and unwavering, had had to submit to an oppressive system, erasing her roots in order to be recognized. A sense of injustice overtook her body. She didn't know whether to cry for her mother or for the anger she felt at how racism had shaped even the life of the woman she admired so much. The man continued, "She wanted you to know that, but she never found the right moment. Now you have the chance not to make the same mistakes. Don't hide who you are, Emily. Be true, even if it means losing a few battles." She read the letter to the end, her chest tight, and then took a deep breath. The past had returned, but this time, it wasn't to destroy her. It was to set her free. She understood for the first time that her mother's choices, although painful, were made in a world where survival came before truth. But Emily was in another moment. Now it was her turn to honor her mother's legacy, but in a different way. She looked up at the man. "Thank you. I know what I have to do."